Max Verstappen is winning races, yet he is leading a rebellion. The paddock watches him now not just as a champion, but as the voice of a grid that has lost faith in its own machines. The new regulations promised a new era of racing, but something feels wrong. Drivers sense it in the way their cars behave, teams whisper about it in the garages, and the sport's governing body finds itself on the back foot. But to understand why this moment matters, you have to look past the podiums and the points. What no broadcast covered is this. Fresh data from post-Japan testing shows power deployment irregularities exceeding 42 kilowatts variance between identical straights. That number changes everything. That's beneath the sleek bodywork of the 2026 spec cars lies a control algorithm so complex that even the engineers who built it admit they cannot fully predict when the car will obey and when it will not. Verstappen called it feeling like a video game. He was not joking. He was describing a system that intervenes in ways drivers cannot control. This is the part that changes everything. The drivers are no longer just complaining, they are united, and they are demanding answers. But unity among 20 of the most competitive athletes on the planet is fragile. What happens next will decide whether Formula One fixes its soul or loses it forever. And to understand why they are willing to risk everything, we have to go inside the garage where the first warning sign appeared and why no one listened. The data from Australia exposed a hidden flaw. Verstappen, Leclerc, and Norris all felt it. MGUK deployment dropping 67% in under 0.3 seconds with no driver input. This was not random. This was the ECU arbitration logic failing, the invisible system that manages power between engine and electric motor. The cars were not just unpredictable, they were unsafe. But the engineers who designed this system knew the risk. So why did it reach the track? Mattia Binotto flagged arbitration latency before the season began. The FIA's post-Japan audit later confirmed a 42 kilowatt variance on identical straights. At 300 kilometers per hour, that variance shifts braking zones by roughly 18 meters. A driver commits to an overtake expecting one behavior, and the car delivers another. That is not a racing challenge. That is a safety crisis hiding inside a technical regulation. Inside Red Bull's garage, our engineers ran degraded mode simulations before Japan. They prepared for the failure, but preparation is not prevention, and that gap is where the real story lives. Because if the best resource team could not fix this before it happened, what hope is there for a mid-season solution? The answer starts with a meeting 3 weeks before Australia, and the one detail nobody wrote down. Verstappen analyzed 147 laps of testing data across 3 circuits to prove the power issue was not track-specific. Leclerc described sudden bursts like a boost, matching Ferrari's aggressive MGUK strategy. Norris admitted winning felt wrong when the system decided the outcome. 3 drivers, 3 teams, 1 identical problem, but when separate voices start describing the same invisible flaw, the paddock stops hearing complaints and starts hearing evidence. Signs warned it was only a matter of time after feeling power loss in China qualifying. Alonso, with 2 decades of experience, asked what drivers are actually competing for if they cannot control the car. Their words carried different weight, but pointed to the same conclusion. The data tells a completely different story when 5 voices from 5 different garages all confirm the same failure mode. But evidence alone does not force action. What no broadcast covered is how the drivers turned concern into leverage. They shared anonymized telemetry showing the exact moment power became unpredictable. That transformed subjective feeling into measurable proof the FIA could not ignore. But proof still needed a catalyst. And that catalyst was already waiting for them on the track in Japan, where theory would become trauma in less than a second. The crash in Japan was not an accident, it was a confirmation. A car ahead lost power instantly at 300 kilometers per hour, not gradually, not predictably. The following car closed the gap at 42 kilometers per hour with less than 0.8 seconds to react. Human reflex cannot respond that fast. The impact registered 50 joule over 0.12 seconds within hands limits, but beyond any driver's anticipation. This was the exact scenario engineers had modeled, but with one critical difference. The real world did not follow the simulation. Dr. Ian Roberts, the FIA medical delegate, has classified unpredictable power loss at high speed as a Category 3 safety risk. That is the same level as brake failure. and the medical car reached the scene in 23 seconds, but the driver's first words were not about pain, they were about the car's behavior. Sector 2 lap times increased by 1.8 seconds across the field immediately after the incident. That is not just caution, that is the entire grid adjusting to a new reality of risk. What no broadcast covered is that the FIA had seen this exact failure mode in preseason simulation. The difference was the ramp down time. Models assumed 0.5 seconds for power loss. Reality delivered 0.0 seconds. That gap between expectation and execution is where safety margins disappear. But if the data existed before the incident, why was it not acted upon? The answer reveals a deeper conflict inside the sport's governing body, one that forced drivers to take matters into their own hands. Fine, the FIA faced a trilemma no regulator wants. Change the rules mid-season and you disrupt the championship. Do nothing and you risk another Japan. Mohammed Ben Sulayem and Nick Tumbazis knew any technical directive required 75% team approval and a 6-month lead time for major changes. But safety-critical issues can bypass that process. The question was, not could they act, the question was, would the teams let them? Inside the technical working group, one engineer leaked a critical detail. Limiting MGUK deployment by 15% would compromise the 2026 efficiency targets that manufacturers signed up for. That is the real conflict. Red Bull and Ferrari invested millions optimizing around the current rules. Asking them to accept mid-season changes means discarding competitive advantage. Just to a 10% reduction in peak MGUK power would increase lap times by an estimated 0.4 to 0.7 seconds. That is not a small adjustment. That is a championship shuffle. But while the FIA debated, the drivers did something unprecedented. They bypassed the usual channels entirely. What no broadcast covered is that the drivers did not just complain. They brought a proposal with a deadline, and that proposal contained a metric the FIA had never been forced to measure before. But to understand how 20 competitive egos agreed on one demand, we have to look inside the room where it happened. George Russell activated the GPDA emergency protocol within 4 hours of the Japan incident. That speed was unprecedented in driver governance. Alex Wurz, with his dual background as ex-driver and safety advocate, gave the group immediate credibility with the FIA, but unity did not happen by accident. It required 20 competitive egos to agree on one message, and that agreement started with data, not opinions. What no broadcast covered is that each driver submitted anonymized telemetry showing the exact millisecond their car became unpredictable. Verstappen's endorsement brought skeptical voices on board. His leadership extended beyond the cockpit into the garage, where trust is earned, not demanded. The drivers did not just ask for changes, they proposed a measurable standard, a predictability index with a 95% consistency threshold. That turned subjective feeling into an engineering target. But a proposal is only as strong as its enforcement, and that is where the drivers did something the FIA never expected. They attached a deadline. Not a request, a timeline. If the changes were not ready for Miami, the drivers would reconsider their approach to the new regulations. That shifted the power dynamic instantly, because when the people inside the car speak with one voice, the people writing the rules have no choice but to listen. But listening is not the same as acting, and the real test of whether action was enough would come on one specific weekend, under one specific set of lights. Miami is the first real test of whether the FIA's changes work. The technical directive includes 3 adjustments: MGUK smoothing, SOC threshold changes, and a new dashboard warning for power loss. Verstappen will push from the first lap to find the new predictability envelope, but pushing a car that has betrayed you before requires different courage. That courage will reveal more than lap times ever could. Norris and McLaren have shown the best adaptability to regulation changes this season. Their performance could indicate whether the fixes are sufficient or superficial. Martin Brundle stated driver confidence is the ultimate metric. If drivers still hesitate on straights, the problem is not solved. Watch Sector 1 straight speed delta. If variance drops below 15 kilometers per hour from the previous more than 40 kilometers per hour, the changes work. If not, the crisis continues. Miami is round 6. Any performance shift now could create a 30-point swing in the championship by mid-season. The drivers united. They demanded change. They set a deadline. Now the FIA must prove listening was enough. But proof requires cars that behave as expected at 300 kilometers per hour. That expectation will be tested under the Miami lights, where the real verdict on Formula One's soul will finally be delivered, and where the consequence of getting this wrong becomes impossible to ignore. Verstappen was never just challenging a rule, he was defending a principle. Racing should be decided by human judgment, not algorithmic arbitration. The 2014 hybrid era faced similar criticism about engine formula racing. F1 adapted by increasing MG UK power and improving sound. That proves course correction is possible, but adaptation requires honesty, and honesty means admitting when innovation has outpaced control. The data tells a completely different story when fan engagement drops 23% because races feel system determined rather than driver determined. The predictability index proposed by drivers could become a new KPI for F1 technical regulations. That would ensure future changes are tested against driver control metrics before adoption. If Miami shows improvement, the title fight regains merit-based integrity. If not, the 2026 season risks becoming a cautionary tale. A story about a sport that chose complexity over connection. The real story was never about the lap time. It was about whether the driver still matters. Because in the end, Formula One is not just about who crosses the line first. It is about whether the journey to get there still feels like racing. And that is a finish line no algorithm can define. If the drivers find that feeling again in Miami, this becomes a turning point that saved the sport. If they do not, this revolt will be remembered as the moment the grid tried to stop Formula One from becoming something it was never meant to be.